The dust-laden wind carried whispers of Harriet Reynolds' shame across the small town of Alta, Wyoming Territory, on that sweltering summer day in 1876. Her tear-stained face remained stoic as she loaded the last of her meager possessions onto the weathered wagon, the jeers of her former in-laws still ringing in her ears. "Barren woman!" they had shouted from the porch of the Grand Reynolds family home, her husband Thomas standing silently beside them, unwilling to defend the wife who could not give him sons. At 23, Harriet found herself cast out, divorced through public humiliation, her 5 years of marriage dissolved by a family who valued bloodlines above love. The Reynolds were cattle barons who needed heirs, and a woman who couldn't provide them was worse than useless in their eyes. Though no doctor had confirmed it was her fault alone, the blame fell squarely on her shoulders. "You best be gone before sundown," Thomas had muttered, not meeting her eyes as he handed her the divorce papers. "Father's given you that old plot near Clearwater Creek. Consider it charity, charity." The word stung worse than any physical blow. Harriet snapped the reins, urging the tired mare forward, away from the town that had once been her home. Alta grew smaller behind her, its church steeple where she'd once exchanged vows disappearing into the horizon. She had no tears left, only a hollow ache where her heart should be, and the weight of solitude pressing upon her shoulders. The land Thomas had gifted her lay 10 miles outside town, a run-down cabin on a rocky patch of earth that the Reynolds didn't consider worth keeping. It had belonged to an old trapper who died the previous winter, and no one had bothered to claim it. By the time Harriet arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the dilapidated structure. The cabin's door hung precariously from one hinge, and the roof had a hole large enough to see the emerging stars. Inside, dust covered every surface, and animal droppings littered the corners. This was to be her new beginning, a broken home for a broken woman. Harriet unhitched her horse and led the tired animal to a lean-to beside the cabin. "At least one of us will have shelter tonight," she whispered, stroking the mare's mane before retrieving her bedroll from the wagon. That night, she slept under the stars, too exhausted to clean the cabin interior, too proud to weep again. Morning would bring work, and work would bring purpose, or so she told herself as she drifted into restless slumber. Dawn arrived with cruel efficiency, birds announcing the new day with cheerful songs that mocked Harriet's misfortune. She rose stiffly from her bedroll, muscles protesting after the uncomfortable night. Her honey-blonde hair, once meticulously styled to please her husband's family, hung in tangled waves around her face. She no longer cared how she looked. There was no one to impress here. Harriet began the daunting task of making the cabin habitable. She swept out years of dust and debris, patched the most egregious holes in the walls with mud and straw, and fashioned a broom from bundled twigs. By midday, sweat soaked through her dress, and her hands were raw and blistered, but the main room at least appeared somewhat livable. The water situation posed her next challenge. Clearwater Creek ran about a quarter-mile from the cabin, down a slight incline. Harriet had brought 2 buckets, which she filled and lugged back up to the cabin, water sloshing over the sides and dampening her skirts. She would need to make this trek several times daily for drinking, cooking, washing, and eventually, she hoped, for a small garden. As she hauled the second pair of buckets back toward the cabin, a voice called out from behind her. "Madam, you need a hand with those." Harriet spun around, nearly dropping her burden. A man sat atop a chestnut stallion, watching her with concern etched across his sun-weathered face. He wore the practical attire of a working cowboy: denim pants, a faded blue shirt, leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his features. Not one of the dandified town cowboys who strutted about Alta in polished boots and fancy spurs. "I'm managing just fine," Harriet replied stiffly, resuming her trek toward the cabin. She'd had enough of men's false concern to last a lifetime. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion and approached, keeping a respectful distance. "Name's Caleb Tucker. I run cattle on the North Range. Didn't know anyone had claimed old Jenkins' place." "Well, now you do," Harriet said, pausing despite herself. "Harriet Reynolds," she stopped abruptly, realizing she couldn't use that name anymore. "Harriet Reid," she corrected, reverting to her maiden name. Caleb's gaze swept over the dilapidated cabin, the single horse, and her wagon with its meager contents. Understanding dawned in his eyes, but mercifully, pity did not. "That roof won't keep out the rain," he observed. "Wyoming Territory sees fierce storms this time of year." "I'm aware of the weather patterns, Mr. Tucker," Harriet snapped, then immediately regretted her harshness. This man had done nothing to deserve her ire. "I apologize. It's been challenging," he nodded, seeming to accept both her sharpness and apology without judgment. "I've got extra timber at my place. Could help you patch that roof before the next storm hits." Suspicion flared within Harriet. In her experience, men didn't offer help without expecting something in return. "And what would you want for this assistance?" Surprise flickered across Caleb's face before he let out a short laugh. "Just being neighborly, madam. Out here, folks look out for each other. That's how we survive." Something in his straightforward manner made Harriet want to believe him. Still, 5 years with the Reynolds family had taught her caution. "I can pay you," she offered, though the small pouch of coins she had would barely last the month if she was frugal. Caleb shook his head. "Not necessary. Though I wouldn't say no to a cup of coffee if you've got any when I come by tomorrow." He tipped his hat and returned to his horse before Harriet could formulate a response. "I'll be here around mid-morning," he called as he mounted his stallion. "Unless you'd rather I didn't come." Harriet hesitated, weighing pride against practicality. The roof did need fixing, and she had no knowledge of such repairs. "Mid-morning would be fine," she conceded. "I do have coffee." With a nod and a smile that creased the corners of his eyes, Caleb Tucker rode away, leaving Harriet to wonder if she'd made a grave mistake or her first ally in this new, unwanted life. True to his word, Caleb arrived the next morning with a wagon loaded with timber, tools, and supplies. He'd brought not only roofing materials but also proper hinges for the door, glass for the single window, and to Harriet's astonishment, a small iron stove. "Found it in my storage shed," he explained when she protested that it was too generous a gift. "Been sitting there collecting dust since I upgraded to a bigger one. It's yours if you want it." Harriet did want it desperately. Cooking over an open fire was tedious and inefficient. Still, accepting such charity went against everything she'd been raised to believe about self-reliance. "I can't possibly think of it as a loan," Caleb interrupted, seeming to understand her struggle. "Until you get on your feet. Wyoming winters are brutal. You'll need proper heat." They worked together throughout the day, Caleb handling the roofing while Harriet cleaned decades of grime from the stovepipe and fittings. By late afternoon, the cabin had transformed from barely habitable to almost cozy. The roof no longer leaked, the door swung properly on its hinges, and the stove pumped welcome heat through the small space. As promised, Harriet brewed coffee, serving it in one of her 2 chipped cups while she took her tea in the other. They sat on rough-hewn chairs outside the cabin, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming landscape in amber and gold. "How long have you been out here?" Harriet asked, genuinely curious about this man who had shown such unexpected kindness. Caleb took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Going on 8 years now." came west after the war between the states, needed open sky after too many years of smoke and death. You fought in the war. Harriet couldn't hide her surprise. He didn't seem old enough, though the fine lines around his eyes spoke of experiences beyond his years. Enlisted at 17. Confederate Army. He said it without pride or shame, simply stating a fact. Lost my family's farm in Georgia afterward. Decided to start fresh where nobody knew me or what I'd done. Harriet nodded, understanding the desire to escape one's past all too well. And you've been alone all this time? The question came out more personal than she'd intended, and she immediately flushed. I apologize, that was presumptuous. Caleb didn't seem offended. Had a partner for a while, Jim Riston. Good man. We built up a decent herd together until a lightning strike took him 2 summers ago. He stared into his coffee cup. Been running the place alone since then. It's manageable, but some days the silence gets mighty loud. I understand that, Harriet said softly. Then, before she could stop herself, the Reynolds cast me out. Thomas divorced me because I couldn't give him children. The words hung in the air between them. Harriet hadn't meant to share something so personal, but something about Caleb Tucker's quiet presence made it feel safe to speak the truth. Caleb's expression darkened. I've had dealings with the Reynolds. Harold Reynolds thinks his money makes him king of Alta. His son's cut from the same cloth. They needed heirs, Harriet said, the old pain surfacing despite her efforts to suppress it. 5 years of marriage and my womb remained empty. The doctor said there might be something wrong with me. Caleb set his cup down with more force than necessary. Sounds like the only thing wrong was being married to a man who valued bloodlines over love. His indignation on her behalf warmed something inside Harriet that had been cold for a very long time. Still, she felt compelled to be honest. You should know. If you're being kind because you're looking for a wife, I can't give you children either. Best to understand that from the start. For a moment, Caleb looked genuinely startled. Then, to Harriet's surprise, he laughed a deep, genuine sound that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Madam, I'm just being a decent neighbor, not proposing marriage. His expression softened. Though if I were looking for a wife, a woman's worth wouldn't be measured by whether she could bear children. There's more than one way to fill a life with meaning. The simple statement, delivered without artifice, brought tears to Harriet's eyes. For 5 years, she'd been judged solely on her inability to conceive. Caleb's words were like cool water on a burn she'd carried for too long. Thank you, she managed, quickly wiping away the moisture from her cheeks. For the roof, and the stove, and the coffee company. Caleb nodded, seemingly understanding everything she wasn't saying. I'll stop by in a few days, see how you're settling in. Bring some vegetable seedlings from my garden if you'd like to start one. I'd appreciate that, Harriet said, and meant it. As promised, Caleb returned 3 days later with seedlings carefully packed in damp burlap. Together, they cleared a patch behind the cabin and planted what would become Harriet's first garden: tomatoes, beans, carrots, and potatoes that might, with luck and care, see her through part of the coming winter. Soil's better than it looks, Caleb observed, crumbling the dark earth between his fingers. Old Jenkins must have worked it years back. With some manure and regular watering, these should take hold nicely. Harriet found herself watching Caleb's hands as he demonstrated how to plant each seedling. Strong, capable hands with calluses that spoke of years of honest work. Nothing like Thomas's soft, manicured fingers that had never known labor. Over the following weeks, Caleb's visits became regular occurrences. He always arrived with some practical offering: a repaired bucket, extra firewood, a sack of cornmeal from his last trip to town. Harriet initially protested such generosity, but soon learned that Caleb Tucker, wasn't a man easily dissuaded once he'd decided to help. In return, Harriet began offering what she could: fresh bread when she had flour to spare, mended shirts when she noticed his were fraying, company and conversation when the day's work was done. They fell into an easy rhythm of give and take, neither keeping score, both finding comfort in the simple presence of another soul who understood the challenges of frontier life. July gave way to August, bringing thunderstorms that tested Caleb's roofing work, which held admirably, and blazing heat that threatened Harriet's fledgling garden. Each morning and evening she trudged to the creek for water, refusing Caleb's offers to dig a well closer to the cabin. Such a project would put her too deeply in his debt, and despite their growing friendship, Harriet was determined to maintain some independence. On a particularly scorching afternoon, Harriet was returning from the creek when she spotted riders approaching from the direction of Alta. 3 men on horseback, moving with purpose toward her cabin. As they drew nearer, her stomach nodded with recognition. Thomas Reynolds rode at the lead, flanked by his younger brother Michael and their foreman, a brutish man named Dawson. Harriet set down her buckets and straightened her shoulders, unwilling to show fear despite the rapid pounding of her heart. She hadn't seen Thomas since the day he'd cast her out, and his presence here could mean nothing good. "Harriet," Thomas greeted her coldly when the riders halted a few paces away. At 30, he still cut a handsome figure with his dark hair and tailored clothes, though his face had hardened into something less appealing than she remembered. "You're looking rustic, Thomas," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "What brings you to my property?" "About that," he said, dismounting and adjusting his riding gloves with deliberate slowness. "There's been a misunderstanding. Father never intended to give you this land permanently. It was meant as a temporary arrangement until you found alternative accommodations." Anger flashed through Harriet like lightning. "That wasn't what you said when you handed me the divorce papers. You said the land was mine." Thomas shrugged. "A verbal agreement holds no weight against written documentation, and there is none stating this land belongs to you." "You know very well I couldn't afford a lawyer to draw up proper papers," Harriet countered, her voice steady despite her rising fury. "Your family made certain of that when they ensured I left with nothing but this plot of land and my personal belongings." Michael Reynolds, always his brother's shadow, snickered from atop his horse. "Come now, Harriet. Surely you didn't think a Barren woman would be entitled to Reynolds' property. Father's been more than generous." Harriet's cheeks burned with humiliation and rage. "Why now? You've left me alone for nearly 2 months. Why come claiming this worthless patch of earth that none of you wanted until I made something of it?" Thomas's eyes narrowed. "Word reached us that you've been entertaining male company frequently. That changes matters." "My friendships are none of your concern," Harriet snapped, immediately understanding that someone in Alta must have seen Caleb visiting and reported back to the Reynolds family. "We're divorced, or have you forgotten?" "What I haven't forgotten," Thomas said, his voice dropping dangerously, "is that you're living on Reynolds' land while apparently courting one of our competitors. Caleb Tucker has been trying to expand his grazing rights for years. How convenient that he's now befriended my former wife." The implication struck Harriet like a physical blow. "Caleb has been a kind neighbor, nothing more. He helped repair this cabin that your family left to rot. Regardless," Thomas continued as if she hadn't spoken, "you have 1 week to vacate. Father's decided to expand our northern pasture and this property is now required." "1 week?" Harriet echoed in disbelief. "Where am I supposed to go?" "Not my concern," Thomas replied coldly. "Though I hear the widow Jenkins in town is looking for a live-in companion, at your age with your condition. You should consider yourself fortunate to have such an option." Before Harriet could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. Caleb Tucker rode into view, his expression darkening as he assessed the situation. He dismounted and moved to stand beside Harriet, his presence solid and reassuring. "Everything all right here, Harriet?" he asked, though his eyes remained fixed on Thomas. "Mr. Tucker," Thomas acknowledged with false civility. "We were just discussing property matters with my former wife." "Former being the operative word," Caleb replied evenly, "meaning you have no claim on her or her decisions anymore." Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "But I do have claim to this land, which remains Reynolds' property. I was just informing Harriet that she needs to make other arrangements within the week." Caleb's jaw tightened visibly. This land belonged to Jenkins. Old man sold it outright before he died. "To my father," Thomas countered smoothly, "who allowed Harriet temporary use of it out of the goodness of his heart. A kindness she's apparently repaid by aligning herself with a known rival." Harriet opened her mouth to protest, but Caleb spoke first. "Seems mighty convenient that you're only remembering this arrangement now that she's made improvements to the property." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "Be careful, Tucker. You're outnumbered here." "Am I?" Caleb's hand drifted casually toward his holstered revolver. "I count 3 men hiding behind their daddy's money and reputation, not particularly intimidating." The tension crackled between them like dry lightning. Harriet stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on Caleb's arm. "This isn't worth bloodshed," she said quietly. "If they want the land so badly, they can have it," Caleb began. "No," she interrupted firmly. "I won't have violence on my account, not ever." Thomas's smug smile returned. "Always the sensible one, Harriet. 1 week." He remounted his horse with practiced ease. "And Tucker, I'd advise keeping your distance from Reynolds' business in the future. Father wouldn't take kindly to your interference." The 3 riders departed, kicking up dust that settled on Harriet's skirts like her hopes dirtied and diminished. When they were out of earshot, Caleb turned to her, his expression troubled. "You can't let them do this. This land is rightfully yours." "Is it?" Harriet asked wearily. "I have no paper saying so. It would be my word against theirs, and in Alta, the Reynolds family might as well be royalty." Caleb ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "This isn't right. You've put weeks of work into this place. And I'll find somewhere else to put in more weeks of work," Harriet said with a determination she didn't entirely feel. "I survived being cast out once. I can do it again." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his gaze traveling over the cabin with its new roof, the freshly cleared yard, the garden beginning to sprout green promises of food. When he looked back at Harriet, his expression had shifted to something she couldn't quite decipher. "Come to my ranch," he said simply. Harriet blinked in surprise. "I beg your pardon, not like that," Caleb clarified quickly, a flush creeping up his neck. "I've got a second cabin, built it for Jim when we first started out before we constructed the main house. It's small but sound. You could stay there, have your own space, maybe help with the cooking and such to earn your keep if you're worried about charity." The offer was tempting more than tempting. In the weeks since they'd met, Harriet had come to respect Caleb deeply. He was honest, hardworking, and unfailingly kind. But moving onto his property would invite the very gossip Thomas had already hinted at, and possibly worse. The Reynolds would see that as confirmation of their suspicions, she pointed out. "They'd make trouble for you." "Let them try," Caleb said with quiet confidence. "My land is properly deeded and registered in Cheyenne. Harold Reynolds might think he owns Alta, but he doesn't own the Wyoming Territory." Harriet hesitated, weighing her limited options. She had nowhere else to go, no family to turn to, and precious little money. The thought of working as a companion to the irascible widow Jenkins, under the watchful and judgmental eyes of Alta's residents, was almost unbearable. "You don't have to decide right now," Caleb added when she remained silent. "Think on it. Offer stands either way." That night after Caleb had gone, Harriet sat on her narrow bed and considered her future. She'd rebuilt once from nothing. Could she do it again? And did she want to? The answer came to her in the still darkness, clear as a bell. No. She was tired of starting over, tired of having her worth determined by others, tired of being alone. When Caleb arrived the next morning, Harriet was already packing her meager possessions. "I'll accept your offer," she told him before he could even dismount. "But I insist on contributing cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever's needed. And I'll pay rent once I've saved enough." Relief washed over Caleb's face. "Agreed. Though I should warn you the place has been empty since Jim died. Might need a woman's touch to make it livable again." Harriet allowed herself a small smile. "I seem to have developed a knack for reviving neglected homes." They spent the day loading Harriet's belongings onto her wagon. The small iron stove came too. It was a gift, not a loan, Caleb insisted, along with carefully transplanted seedlings from her garden. By late afternoon, they were ready to depart, leaving behind the cabin that had briefly been Harriet's sanctuary. Caleb's ranch lay 15 miles northwest of Harriet's former property, situated in a picturesque valley with a year-round stream cutting through lush pastureland. The main house, a substantial 2-story structure built of solid timber, sat on a gentle rise overlooking corrals, a barn, and several outbuildings. Half a mile distant, near a stand of cottonwood trees, stood a smaller cabin. "That's where you'd be," Caleb explained as they approached. "Close enough if you need anything, far enough for privacy." The cabin proved larger than Harriet had expected, 2 rooms instead of 1, with a stone fireplace and proper wooden floors. Like her previous dwelling, it showed signs of neglect. Dust-covered surfaces, cobwebs in corners, a faint mustiness that spoke of disuse. Unlike the previous cabin, however, its structure was sound, with a good roof, tight-fitting door, and glass windows that would keep out Wyoming's fierce winter winds. "It's perfect," Harriet said, meaning it, "though it will need a thorough cleaning." "Take whatever time you need to settle in," Caleb offered. "There's no rush to start earning your keep. Winter's still months away." But Harriet was already rolling up her sleeves, eager to transform this new space into something that felt like home. With Caleb's help, she unloaded her wagon and set up the iron stove, which immediately began driving the dampness from the cabin's interior. "I'll leave you to it then," Caleb said once everything was inside. "Come up to the main house for supper if you're feeling sociable. Otherwise, there's provisions in that basket should last a few days." Harriet thanked him, suddenly shy now that the reality of their arrangement was setting in. They weren't merely neighbors anymore. She was living on his property, accepting his protection. It created an intimacy neither had anticipated when he'd first stopped to help her with water buckets all those weeks ago. Over the following days, Harriet established a routine. Mornings were spent cleaning and organizing her new home. Afternoons working in Caleb's large vegetable garden or helping with household tasks in the main house. Evenings often found them sharing meals, sometimes in comfortable silence, other times engaged in conversation that ranged from practical matters of ranch management to deeper discussions of their respective pasts. Harriet learned that Caleb had been the youngest of 4 brothers, all lost to the war, that he still wrote monthly letters to his mother in Georgia, though she rarely replied, that he preferred coffee to whiskey, books to cards, and found more peace working with horses than people. In turn, She shared parts of herself she'd kept hidden during her marriage, her love of poetry, her dream of someday traveling to San Francisco, her childhood in Illinois before her family had moved west, seeking better opportunities. August melded into September, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color to the cottonwoods. Harriet's transplanted garden flourished in its new location, and she took quiet pride in preserving its bounty for the winter ahead, canning tomatoes, drying beans, storing root vegetables in the cool cellar beneath Caleb's house. Word of her new living arrangement eventually reached Alta, carried by the ranch hands Caleb occasionally sent to town for supplies. The gossip didn't surprise Harriet, though the intensity of it did. According to Pete, Caleb's most trusted cowboy, Harriet Reynolds himself had declared from his seat in the Alta Cattlemen's Association that Tucker has taken in Reynolds' cast-off to spite us. Folks talking all sorts of nonsense, Pete reported one evening as they sat around Caleb's kitchen table. Some saying you two are married in secret, others claiming worse. Reynolds making noise about water rights again, using this as excuse to push his boundaries north. Caleb's expression hardened. Let him try. My water rights are legally documented. He can't touch the stream that runs through my property. Still, Pete warned, man like that has influence. Judge Crawford owes him favors. Might be trouble coming. After Pete left, Harriet sat quietly by the fire, guilt weighing heavily on her shoulders. Perhaps I should leave, she said finally. Find work in Cheyenne or Laramie. I'm bringing you nothing but difficulty. Is that what you want? Caleb asked, his voice carefully neutral. To leave? No, Harriet admitted after a moment's reflection. But I don't want to be the cause of problems for you either. Caleb moved to sit beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, but not so near as to be improper. Harriet, the Reynolds have been looking for reasons to challenge my boundaries since I refused to sell to them 3 years ago. You're just a convenient excuse. Still nothing, he interrupted gently. I've stood against them alone for years. I'm not about to back down now that I have someone worth standing with. The simple declaration, delivered without fanfare, sent a flutter through Harriet's chest that she hadn't experienced in a very long time. She looked at Caleb, really looked at him, and saw not just the kind neighbor who had helped repair her cabin, but a man of principle and quiet strength, who had somehow become essential to her happiness. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with a cautious warmth that spread through her body like good whiskey. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. Caleb held her gaze for a long moment before nodding. Get some rest. Tomorrow's cattle drive preparation. All hands needed, including yours if you're willing. Harriet had never worked with cattle before, but she found herself eagerly anticipating the new experience. I'll be ready at dawn. The cattle drive preparation consumed the next several days. Caleb's operation was modest compared to the Reynolds' vast herds, just 200 head being moved to southern grazing lands for the winter. But it still required considerable planning and effort. Harriet found herself assigned to food preparation, ensuring the 4 cowboys who would accompany the herd had sufficient provisions for their journey. On the evening before the drive was to begin, Caleb invited Harriet to ride with him to check the gathering herd. They set out as the sun began its descent, painting the landscape in rich golds and ambers. Harriet rode side saddle on a gentle mare Caleb had trained specifically for ladies, her skirts arranged modestly around her. You sit a horse well, Caleb observed as they trotted toward the northern pasture. Most town ladies I've known clutch the saddle horn like they're drowning. Harriet laughed. My father insisted all his children learn to ride properly, said it was the most important skill in the West, more valuable than reading or ciphering. Wise man. He was, Harriet agreed, memories of her father dead now 7 years bringing both sadness and fondness. Though my mother disagreed vehemently. She thought riding made girls unladylike and unmarriageable. And yet you married, Caleb pointed out. Yes. Though perhaps Mother was right after all, since it didn't last. They reached a ridge overlooking the valley where the cattle were gathered, a sea of brown and black backs shifting restlessly as cowboys rode the perimeter, keeping the herd together. The setting sun gilded the scene with an almost painterly beauty. "Thomas never deserved you," Caleb said suddenly, his voice low and intense. A man who would cast aside his wife for something neither could control never understood what marriage truly means. Harriet's breath caught at the unexpected declaration. "And what does it truly mean in your estimation?" Caleb turned in his saddle to face her fully, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. "Partnership. Facing life's joys and sorrows together. Building something that matters, whether that's a family with children or one of your own making." "That sounds beautiful," Harriet said softly, "and rarer than it should be," Caleb agreed. "My parents had it before consumption took my mother. She couldn't have more children after me complications during my birth. Father never once made her feel lesser for it, said I was miracle enough." Harriet felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "You were fortunate to witness such love." "I was," Caleb acknowledged. "And it taught me to recognize what matters in a partner: kindness, courage, strength of character." His eyes held hers steadily. "The very qualities I've seen in you since the day we met." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Harriet found herself unable to look away from Caleb's gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild thing seeking freedom. "Caleb." The moment shattered as gunshots echoed across the valley, followed by shouts and the unmistakable sound of cattle beginning to stampede. Caleb's head snapped toward the commotion, his expression immediately shifting to alarm. "Get back to the house," he ordered, already turning his horse toward the chaos below. "Now, Harriet." Before she could protest, he was galloping down the slope toward the panicked herd, drawing his revolver as he rode. Harriet hesitated only briefly before urging her mare back toward the ranch house, understanding that her presence would only complicate whatever situation was unfolding. From the safety of the ridge, however, she paused to look back. In the fading light, she could make out riders not Caleb's men driving the cattle southward, away from the designated gathering area. Even at a distance, Harriet recognized the distinctive hat one rider wore, Michael Reynolds. Cold fury replaced fear in Harriet's chest. The Reynolds were rustling Caleb's cattle using the cover of dusk, and the upcoming drive as opportunity to steal what they couldn't legally claim. And they were doing it, at least in part, because of her presence on Caleb's ranch. Instead of returning to the house as instructed, Harriet guided her mare along the ridgeline, keeping to the shadows of scattered pines. If she could circle around to the southern boundary, she might be able to warn Caleb's men stationed there before the rustlers arrived with the stolen cattle. The plan was dangerous foolhardy. Even but Harriet couldn't stand by while the Reynolds destroyed what Caleb had worked so hard to build. Not when she felt partially responsible for their renewed aggression. Darkness fell quickly as Harriet rode, making navigation increasingly difficult. The mare, sensing her rider's tension, moved carefully along the unfamiliar path. In the valley below, Harriet could hear the continued commotion, shouting men, bellowing cattle, the occasional crack of a revolver that made her flinch with worry for Caleb's safety. After what seemed an eternity but was likely only half an hour, Harriet spotted lamplight ahead the southern line cabin where two of Caleb's hands should be stationed. She urged the mare forward, relief washing through her. The relief was short-lived. As she drew closer, Harriet realized the cabin door stood open, its interior dark despite the lamp hanging on the porch. No voices called out in greeting, no movement suggested occupancy. Caution made her halt the mare some distance away. Something wasn't right. The hair on the back of Harriet's neck stood up in primal warning. A twig snapped behind her. Before Harriet could turn, a rough hand clamped over her mouth while another arm snaked around her waist, dragging her from the saddle. She fought instinctively, kicking and thrashing, but her attacker was too strong. "Look what we caught," a familiar voice drawled in her ear. Dawson, the Reynolds foreman. The Barren woman playing cowgirl. Harriet bit down hard on the hand covering her mouth. Dawson cursed and loosened his grip enough for her to wrench free and stumble forward. She turned to face him, backing away slowly. "What have you done with Caleb's men?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. Dawson's smile was cruel in the moonlight. "Tied up inside. They'll live, assuming someone finds them before they die of thirst." He advanced on her. "You, though, you're coming with us. Mr. Reynolds wants a word." "Which Mr. Reynolds?" Harriet spat. "The coward who divorced me for failing to breed, or the tyrant who raised him?" The blow came without warning, a backhanded strike that sent Harriet sprawling into the dirt, her cheek burning with pain. She tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. "You'll show respect when speaking of your betters," Dawson growled, standing over her. "On your feet. Now." Harriet rose slowly, using the movement to scan her surroundings for anything that might serve as a weapon. There was nothing but open ground between her and the darkened cabin. A gunshot rang out, startlingly close, followed by Dawson's howl of pain. He clutched his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers as he dropped to his knees. "The next one goes through your head if you so much as breathe in her direction again." Caleb's voice came from the darkness, cold as a mountain stream in winter. He materialized from the shadows, revolver trained steadily on Dawson, his expression murderous. Behind him rode Pete and another ranch hand, both armed and vigilant. "Harriet," Caleb said without taking his eyes off Dawson, "are you hurt?" "Just my pride," she answered, moving to stand beside him. "Your men, we found them," Pete interrupted. "Tied up but alive. Bastards left them to watch their herd being stolen." Caleb nodded grimly. "Round up Dawson's horse. We're taking him to the sheriff in Alta." "Sheriff's in Reynolds' pocket," Dawson sneered despite his injury. "You've got nothing." "I've got you caught red-handed in a rustling operation," Caleb countered. "And witnesses who aren't on my payroll. Even Sheriff Davis can't ignore that." The ride to Alta was tense and silent. Dawson, his wound bandaged by Pete, rode with his hands bound to his saddle horn. Harriet insisted on accompanying them despite Caleb's concerns, her cheek swelling where Dawson had struck her. Dawn was breaking as they reached the small town. Early risers stopped to stare at the unusual procession. Caleb Tucker, the Barren ex-wife of Thomas Reynolds, and the Reynolds foreman in restraints. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, a small crowd had gathered. Sheriff Davis emerged from his building, coffee cup in hand, his expression suggesting the day had already become more complicated than he'd hoped. "What's all this, Tucker?" "Rustling," Caleb stated flatly. "Dawson and at least 3 other men, including Michael Reynolds, drove off nearly half my herd last night, assaulted 2 of my hands in the process. And this one," he gestured to Dawson, "struck a woman." The sheriff's gaze moved to Harriet's bruised face, then back to Caleb. "Serious charges." "Got proof. My men will testify. So will Mrs. Reed." Caleb's tone brooked no argument, and I expect you to send telegrams to Cheyenne and Laramie warning them to be on the lookout for cattle bearing my brand." Davis sighed heavily. "You know who you're accusing, Tucker." "I know exactly who I'm accusing," Caleb replied evenly. "The question is whether you're going to do your job or prove everyone right about whose pocket you live in." A tense silence fell over the street. Harriet held her breath, watching the sheriff's internal struggle play across his weathered face. Finally, he nodded to his deputy. "Lock Dawson up. Send those telegrams." He turned to Caleb. "I'll need statements from all of you, and I'll have to speak with Harriet Reynolds." "We expected nothing less," Caleb said, dismounting. He helped Harriet down from her mare, his touch gentle despite the anger still evident in his posture. The next several hours passed in a flurry of activity. Statements were taken, telegrams sent, and a small posse organized to track the stolen cattle. By noon, word arrived that men matching the description of the other rustlers had been spotted driving cattle toward the territorial border, seemingly in a hurry. Throughout it all, Harriet remained by Caleb's side, ignoring the whispers and stares of Alta's residents. Let them talk, she thought defiantly. She had nothing to be ashamed of. Just as they were preparing to depart for the ranch, having done all they could in town, a commotion arose at the far end of the main street. Harriet Reynolds himself approached on horseback, flanked by Thomas and several armed men. The elderly cattle baron's face was a thundercloud of rage. "Tucker," he bellowed, halting his horse directly in front of Caleb. "You dare accuse my son of rustling, based on what the word of my son's discarded wife and your hired hands." Caleb stood his ground, unintimidated by the display. "Based on what my own eyes saw, Mr. Reynolds. Your son was driving my cattle south with 3 other men last night. Dawson's already admitted his involvement." "Under duress, no doubt," Harold scoffed. "Everyone knows the woman living on your property. Everyone knows why she's there to help you steal what rightfully belongs to the Reynolds family." Harriet stepped forward, unable to remain silent in the face of such slander. "I was cast out by your son because I couldn't give him children," she said, her voice carrying clearly down the street. "Caleb Tucker offered me shelter when no one else would. That's the extent of this conspiracy you've invented." Thomas's face flushed crimson. "Be silent, Harriet, you've caused enough trouble." "No," she replied, standing taller. "I won't be silent anymore. Not about how your family treated me. Not about how you're trying to destroy a good man's livelihood because he showed kindness where you showed cruelty." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. For all their power, the Reynolds weren't universally beloved in Alta. Their high-handed business practices had created resentments among smaller ranchers and townspeople alike. Harriet Reynolds recognized the shifting sentiment. His expression hardened as he addressed Caleb again. "This isn't over, Tucker. Not by a long shot. Sheriff, I expect my foreman released immediately. These charges are absurd." Sheriff Davis, to his credit, shook his head. "Can't do that, Harold. Not until we locate the stolen cattle and determine exactly what happened. Law's the law." "You'll regret this," Harold warned, wheeling his horse around. "All of you." As the Reynolds contingent departed, Caleb placed a protective hand on Harriet's back. "We should leave while we can. No telling what they'll try next." The return journey to the ranch was subdued. Both Harriet and Caleb lost in thought about the confrontation and its potential consequences. The Reynolds family wasn't known for accepting defeat graciously, and they had resources far beyond what Caleb could muster. "I'm sorry," Harriet said as they rode side by side. "My presence has made everything worse for you." Caleb shook his head firmly. "None of this is your fault, Harriet. The Reynolds have wanted my land for years. They'd have found another excuse if you weren't here." "Perhaps," she conceded. but I can't help feeling responsible. The only people responsible are those who chose to steal what wasn't theirs, Caleb insisted. And maybe me, for not being more vigilant. They crested the final ridge before Caleb's valley came into view. In the afternoon light, the ranch looked peaceful, the main house solid and welcoming, the remaining cattle grazing contentedly in the northern pasture. It struck Harriet then how much this place had come to feel like home in just a few short weeks. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "What you've built here." Caleb's gaze followed hers, pride and concern mingling in his expression. "It's taken 8 years of hard work. I won't let them take it." "No," Harriet agreed. "We won't." The "we" slipped out unbidden, but once spoken, Harriet found she didn't want to retract it. Somewhere along the way, Caleb's struggles had become her own, his ranch a place she was willing to fight for alongside him. Caleb looked at her, something indefinable shifting in his eyes. For a breathless moment, Harriet thought he might speak, might put words to the unspoken connection that had been growing between them. Instead, he simply nodded, a gesture that somehow conveyed more than words could have. The next several days passed in heightened vigilance. Caleb posted men at the boundaries of his property, rotating shifts to ensure someone was always watching for trouble. Harriet took over more domestic duties, freeing the ranch hands for guard duty and regular chores. They received word that the stolen cattle had been recovered near the territorial border. The rustlers scattered but identified, including Michael Reynolds, who had mysteriously disappeared from Alta. A week after the rustling attempt, Sheriff Davis rode out to the ranch with news. The territorial judge would arrive within the month to hear the case against Dawson, and by extension, the Reynolds family. Until then, Dawson remained in custody despite Harold Reynolds' continued protests. "Judge Harper's fair," Davis informed them as they sat in Caleb's kitchen. "Not the sort to be swayed by money or influence. If your men's testimony holds up, you've got a solid case." "And if it doesn't?" Harriet asked, voicing the concern Caleb wouldn't. Davis sighed heavily. "Then the Reynolds will be emboldened. They've already filed a formal challenge to Caleb's water rights, claiming the stream that feeds his property originates on Reynolds' land and is therefore theirs to control." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he showed no other reaction to this unwelcome news. "My deeds are clear. The water rights came with the property." "I don't doubt it," Davis replied. "But Harold Reynolds has lawyers in Cheyenne who specialize in finding loopholes in territorial law. Just be prepared." After the sheriff departed, Harriet found Caleb standing on his porch, staring out at the land that might soon be threatened not just by rustlers, but by legal maneuvering that could prove even more devastating. "We'll fight," she said, joining him at the railing. "However we need to." Caleb glanced at her, a small smile softening his worried expression. "When did you become such a warrior, Harriet Reed?" "Perhaps I always was," she replied thoughtfully, "but had no cause worth fighting for until now." The admission hung between them, laden with implications neither was quite ready to voice aloud. Instead of responding directly, Caleb reached across the small space separating them and covered her hand with his own, a gesture as simple as it was profound. They stood together as the sun set, hands joined, watching darkness gather over the land they both now sought to protect. Whatever came next, Harriet realized, they would face it together. The thought brought her more comfort than she could express. The following Sunday, Caleb surprised Harriet by suggesting they attend church services in Alta. "It's time we stopped hiding," he explained when she questioned the wisdom of returning to town so soon. "Let people see we have nothing to be ashamed of." Harriet agreed, though not without trepidation. She wore her best dress, a blue calico she'd carefully mended and pressed, and arranged her hair in a modest style appropriate for church. When Caleb saw her descend from her cabin to the waiting buggy, his appreciative gaze made her cheeks warm. "You look lovely," he said simply, helping her onto the seat beside him. The journey to Alta passed pleasantly, the autumn morning crisp and bright with promise. They discussed mundane matters, the garden harvest, preparations for winter. A colt Caleb was training, avoiding the heavier subjects that had dominated their conversations of late. Their arrival at the Alta Community Church caused exactly the stir Harriet had anticipated. Conversations halted mid-sentence as heads turned to observe Caleb Tucker escorting Thomas Reynolds' former wife up the church steps. Some expressions showed open disapproval, others mere curiosity, while a few offered tentative smiles of support. Reverend Miller, to his credit, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Tucker, Mrs. Reed, how delightful to see you both this fine morning." They took seats near the back, allowing Harriet a clear view of the congregation, including, she noted with a sinking feeling, Harold Reynolds and Thomas in the front pew. Both men studiously avoided looking in their direction. Though several Reynolds Ranch hands scattered throughout the church made no effort to hide their glares. The service proceeded without incident, Reverend Miller delivering a sermon on forgiveness and community that seemed pointedly relevant to the current tensions in Alta. When the final hymn concluded and the congregation began to disperse, Harriet steeled herself for the inevitable interactions. She didn't have to wait long. Martha Wilson, the milliner's wife and one of Alta's most notorious gossips, approached with determined cheerfulness. "Harriet, dear, how wonderful to see you looking so well. We've all been so concerned." "Have you?" Harriet replied evenly, knowing perfectly well that Martha had been among those who'd shunned her after the divorce. "How kind." Martha's smile tightened. "Well, naturally. When we heard you were living out at the Tucker Ranch, alone and unprotected, well, you can imagine the talk." "I'm neither alone nor unprotected, Mrs. Wilson," Harriet stated firmly. "Mr. Tucker has kindly provided me with my own cabin and employment after the Reynolds family reclaimed the property they'd initially given me." "Oh, well, that's charitable of him." Martha's gaze flicked to Caleb, who was engaged in conversation with several men nearby. Though one does wonder about his motivations, a bachelor taking in a divorced woman, Harriet's patience, already strained, snapped. "His motivation, Mrs. Wilson, was basic human decency, something in short supply among those who whisper behind fans rather than offer actual assistance to someone in need." Martha's mouth opened in shock, but before she could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "Well said, Mrs. Reed." Harriet turned to find Margaret Porter, the elderly widow of Alta's founding doctor, standing beside her. Margaret was one of the few people in town whose opinion carried enough weight to challenge even the Reynolds family. "Thank you, Mrs. Porter," Harriet replied, genuinely pleased to see the older woman. During her marriage, Margaret had been one of the few to treat Harriet with consistent kindness, never joining in the whispered speculation about her childless state. "Martha, perhaps you might check if Reverend Miller needs assistance with the communion vessels," Margaret suggested pointedly. "He mentioned being short-handed today." Effectively dismissed, Martha retreated with a forced smile and obvious reluctance. Margaret turned her full attention to Harriet. "I've been meaning to call on you, my dear, but wasn't certain of my welcome after everything." The older woman's kind eyes reflected genuine regret. "I should have reached out sooner." "You've nothing to apologize for," Harriet assured her. "You were always kind to me." "Not kind enough, apparently." Margaret sighed. "This town can be vicious to those who don't conform to its expectations. I should know. They nearly drove me out after William died because I insisted on maintaining his medical practice until a new doctor could be found." Caleb joined them, greeting Margaret with evident respect. "Mrs. Porter, good to see you. And you, Mr. Tucker. I was just telling Harriet I owe her a proper visit. Perhaps you'd both join me for tea next Thursday." The invitation, so normal, so accepting, brought unexpected tears to Harriet's eyes. "We'd be honored," she answered before Caleb could speak, though his nod indicated agreement. "Excellent. 2 o'clock, then." Margaret patted Harriet's hand. "And don't fret about the gossips, my dear. They tire quickly when their targets refuse to provide the expected entertainment." As they prepared to leave the churchyard, Harriet noticed Thomas approaching, his expression unreadable. Caleb tensed beside her, but she placed a restraining hand on his arm. "I need to do this," she murmured. "Please." After a moment's hesitation, Caleb nodded and stepped back slightly close enough to intervene if needed, but giving her space to confront her past. Thomas halted before her, hat in hand, looking more uncertain than Harriet had ever seen him. "Harriet," he acknowledged stiffly. "You're looking well." "Thank you." She kept her tone neutral, waiting. "I wanted to. That is." Thomas cleared his throat. "Father refuses to apologize for anything, but I wanted you to know that I didn't authorize or participate in the rustling. Michael acted on his own against my counsel." Harriet studied her former husband, searching for sincerity in his carefully composed features. "Why tell me this? Why not Caleb? It was his cattle your brother attempted to steal." "Tucker wouldn't believe anything I said," Thomas replied with a flash of the old arrogance. "And regardless of our past, I never wished you harm, Harriet. What Michael did, what Dawson did to you, was inexcusable." The admission surprised her. "Is that an apology, Thomas?" "As close to one as you're likely to get," he said, a hint of his former self showing through. "Father still intends to pursue the water rights claim. That hasn't changed. But I wanted you to know I've ordered our men to leave you, both of you, unmolested." It wasn't much, but it was more than Harriet had expected. "Thank you for that, at least." Thomas nodded stiffly, then walked away without another word, returning to where his father waited by their carriage, disapproval evident in the old man's rigid posture. "What was that about?" Caleb asked when Harriet rejoined him. "A very limited peace offering," she explained as they made their way to their own buggy. "The rustling may have been a bridge too far, even for the Reynolds." "I wouldn't count on it," Caleb warned. "Harold Reynolds doesn't admit defeat easily." "No," Harriet agreed. "But it's something, at least." The ride back to the ranch was thoughtful, both processing the morning's events. Alta's reactions had been mixed but not universally hostile, a hopeful sign. Margaret Porter's friendly overture suggested at least some in town were willing to judge them on their own merits rather than gossip. As they neared the ranch, Caleb cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant, "about what happens after the hearing." Harriet's heart skipped uncomfortably. "Oh, if the judge rules in our favor, the immediate threat from the Reynolds will be diminished, not eliminated, but diminished." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "You might feel more comfortable returning to town, or perhaps moving on to a larger settlement with more opportunities for a woman of your talents." The suggestion struck Harriet like a physical blow. "Are you asking me to leave?" "No." Caleb's response was immediate and emphatic. He pulled the buggy to a halt on the deserted road, finally turning to face her. "God, no, Harriet. The opposite, in fact. I don't understand." Caleb took a deep breath, gathering courage for whatever he meant to say. "These past weeks, having you at the ranch, seeing your strength and determination, sharing meals and conversation and life, it's made me realize how empty everything was before." Hope bloomed in Harriet's chest, fragile but insistent. "Caleb, please, let me finish before I lose my nerve," he interrupted gently. "What I'm trying to say poorly is that I don't want you to leave, Ever. I want you to stay not as my employee or tenant but as my wife, if you'll have me." The world seemed to still around them. Harriet stared at Caleb, searching his face for any sign of doubt or pity. She found only sincerity and something deeper, an emotion she'd begun to think she'd never inspire in a man again. "You know I can't give you children," she said quietly, needing to be absolutely clear. The doctors were quite certain. Caleb reached across the space between them and took her hands in his. "Harriet Reed, I'm not asking you to give me children. I'm asking you to give me your heart, your partnership, your days and nights and all the years we might have together." His thumbs traced gentle circles on her skin. "If children come, they come. If they don't, then I'll fill your days with love instead." Tears spilled down Harriet's cheeks, but for once they weren't born of sorrow or shame. "Are you certain? Truly certain?" "Because I couldn't bear it if you came to resent me later." "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," Caleb answered, his voice steady and sure. "I love you, Harriet, not for what you might give me, but for who you are." Harriet's heart felt too full for her chest, emotions crowding her throat and making speech difficult. This man, this good, honorable man, was offering her everything she'd thought forever beyond her reach. Love without condition, acceptance without reservation, a future without shame. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly. "Yes, I will marry you, Caleb Tucker." Joy transformed his face, years falling away as he gathered her into an embrace that somehow managed to be both gentle and fiercely possessive. When he kissed her, their first kiss, Harriet felt something long dormant within her burst into bloom, a capacity for joy she'd thought withered beyond recovery. "I love you," she murmured against his lips when they finally broke apart. "I think I have since you helped me carry water buckets that first day." Caleb laughed, the sound rich with happiness. "And I've loved you since I watched you stubbornly insist on paying me for fixing your roof." They continued homeward, hands joined between them, the future suddenly rich with possibility. The challenges hadn't disappeared. Harriet Reynolds would still pursue his water rights claim. Alta's gossips would still whisper, but they seemed manageable now. Obstacles to be faced together rather than alone. News of their engagement spread quickly through Alta, generating the expected mixture of scandal, speculation, and grudging acceptance. Margaret Porter, true to her word, hosted them for tea, raising her cup in a toast to their future happiness, and offering Harriet her mother's wedding gown if she wished to use it. "William and I had no daughters," the elderly woman explained, "and it seems a shame for such beautiful craftsmanship to remain packed away when it could bring joy to a new bride." Judge Harper arrived as scheduled in early October to hear the case against Dawson, and by proxy, the Reynolds rustling operation. The proceedings lasted 3 days, during which Harriet and Caleb's ranch hands testified to what they had witnessed. Michael Reynolds, having fled to Colorado, was charged in absentia. Dawson, facing the prospect of a lengthy prison term, eventually implicated both Michael and Harriet Reynolds in planning the rustling operation. The judge's ruling was unequivocal. Dawson received 5 years in the territorial prison, Michael was declared a fugitive subject to arrest, and Harriet Reynolds was fined a substantial sum for his role in the conspiracy. Furthermore, Judge Harper dismissed the water rights claim as a transparent attempt to harass and dispossess a legitimate landowner through legal chicanery. The Reynolds family's grip on Alta was not broken, but it was significantly weakened. Several smaller ranchers, emboldened by the outcome, came forward with their own grievances against the cattle Barren, leading to additional legal challenges. Through it all, Harriet and Caleb prepared for their wedding, scheduled for the first Sunday in November. Harriet wore Margaret Porter's offered gown, altered to fit her smaller frame. The ceremony took place in Alta's church, Reverend Miller officiating with evident pleasure. The pews held more well-wishers than either bride or groom, had expected ranch hands and their families. Merchants from town, smaller ranchers who respected Caleb's integrity, and even a few Reynolds employees who attended in defiance of their employer's explicit disapproval. Thomas Reynolds did not attend, though he sent a silver serving set as a wedding gift, a gesture of reconciliation that surprised both Harriet and Caleb. Harold Reynolds pointedly left town for Cheyenne the day before the ceremony, taking his bitterness and wounded pride with him. After the service, the couple hosted a celebration at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns hanging from trees. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and a sense of community that Harriet had never truly experienced during her years as Thomas Reynolds' wife. As the evening progressed, Caleb drew Harriet away from the festivities to a quiet spot near the creek, where moonlight silvered the flowing water. "Happy, Mrs. Tucker?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. Harriet leaned into his embrace, savoring the solid strength of him against her back. "Completely, Mr. Tucker." She turned in his arms to face him. "Though I still worry sometimes that you might regret," Caleb silenced her with a tender kiss. "No regrets," he promised when they parted. "Not now, not ever." "But your legacy," Harriet persisted, giving voice to the concern that occasionally still haunted her quiet moments. "Who will inherit all you've built? We might still be blessed with children," Caleb reminded her gently. "The doctors could be wrong, and if they're not—" He gestured toward the celebration, where Pete was teaching one of the town girls a lively dance. "There are young men who work this land as if it were their own. Jim's nephew arrives from St. Louis next spring. Family isn't always about blood, Harriet." The wisdom in his words settled over her like a warm blanket. "You're right. Of course you're right. Besides," Caleb added with a mischievous glint in his eye, "we have other options. The orphanage in Laramie always has children in need of homes. Why should we let this big house go to waste?" Harriet stared at him, hope fluttering in her chest. "You'd consider adoption." "I'd consider anything that would make you happy," he replied honestly. "But yes, I've thought about it. A home should have children's laughter in it. How those children come to us matters less than the love we could give them." Tears welled in Harriet's eyes for what felt like the 100th time that day. "Just when I think I couldn't possibly love you more." Caleb brushed away a tear with his thumb. "We have time, Harriet. Time to decide. Time to try for children of our own if that's what you want. Time to build the family that's right for us, whatever form it takes." They returned to their guests hand in hand, Harriet's heart lighter than it had been in years. The future stretched before them, not without challenges or hardships, but rich with possibilities neither had dared imagine before finding each other. Winter came early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow by mid-November. Harriet and Caleb settled into married life with a naturalness that surprised them both. The smaller cabin where Harriet had initially stayed became a guest house, while she moved into the main house, bringing her feminine touch to rooms that had been functional but sparse during Caleb's bachelor years. They established routines: morning coffee on the porch when weather permitted, evenings reading aloud by the fire, Sundays in Alta for church services, followed by visits with their growing circle of friends. Caleb taught Harriet to shoot with accuracy, while she introduced him to the poetry she'd loved as a girl. They learned each other's bodies with tender exploration, finding joy in physical intimacy that transcended its procreative purpose. By spring, the ranch was flourishing under their combined care. Harriet's expanded garden promised abundant vegetables, and Caleb's selective breeding program was producing stronger, healthier calves. The water rights issue remained permanently resolved, and while Harriet Reynolds still occasionally made veiled threats, his power in the territory had diminished considerably following the rustling scandal. One warm May afternoon, as Harriet sorted through seed packets for late planting, Caleb returned from Alta with the mail and unexpected news. "Sheriff Davis stopped me in town," he said, settling beside her at the kitchen table. "Thomas Reynolds is selling his shares in the family ranch and moving to San Francisco. Apparently, he's met a widow there with business interests he intends to manage." Harriet absorbed this information thoughtfully. "I hope she fares better with the Reynolds name than I did." According to Davis, the lady already has 3 children from her first marriage, so there's no pressure regarding heirs. Caleb watched her face carefully. "Are you all right with this news?" Harriet considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said finally. "I wish him well, truly, what we had. It was never what I've found with you, never what marriage should be." Caleb smiled, relieved. "I'm glad, because I have something else to tell you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a letter. "This came today from the orphanage in Laramie. They have 2 children siblings, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4 whose parents died of influenza this winter. They've been struggling to keep them together, as most families only want to adopt a single child." Harriet's heart began to race. They discussed adoption over the winter months, agreeing to consider it seriously come spring. "And," she prompted, "and they wanted to know if we might be interested in meeting the children." Caleb's expression was cautiously hopeful. "The director remembers me from when Jim and I donated lumber for their new dormitory a few years back. Said she thought of us specifically because we have the space and resources for 2 children. 2 children, Harriet repeated, the words feeling simultaneously weighty and buoyant. "A ready-made family." "Only if you're ready," Caleb assured her quickly. "We can wait or look for a single child if that seems less overwhelming, or continue trying for our own. This is just one possibility." Harriet rose from her chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the ranch that had become her home, the garden she'd planted, the chicken coop she'd insisted they build, the corral where Caleb broke horses with patient skill. She imagined children's voices adding to the symphony of daily life, small footprints alongside their larger ones, bedtime stories and scraped knees and birthday celebrations. "When can we meet them?" she asked, turning back to her husband with shining eyes. Caleb's face broke into a grin of pure joy. "Next week, if you'd like. We need to stay overnight in Laramie." "Yes," Harriet said decisively. "Let's go next week." The journey to Laramie passed in a mixture of excitement and trepidation. What if the children didn't like them? What if Harriet failed at motherhood as she had at bearing children? What if Caleb discovered, too late, that he'd prefer children of his own blood? The orphanage was a well-maintained building on the outskirts of Laramie, surrounded by a play yard where a dozen or so children enjoyed the spring sunshine under the watchful eyes of 2 matrons. Harriet's grip on Caleb's hand tightened as they approached the entrance. "They'll love you," he murmured reassuringly. "How could they not?" Mrs. Bennett, the director, greeted them warmly and led them to her office, where she explained the children's situation in more detail. Their parents had been homesteaders who'd succumbed to the influenza outbreak that had swept through several settlements during the harsh winter. The children, Matthew and Emma Wilson, had been at the orphanage for 3 months. "They're good children," Mrs. Bennett assured them. "Understandably grieving, particularly Matthew, who's old enough to understand what's happened, but resilient as children often are. Would you like to meet them now?" Harriet nodded, unable to trust her voice. Caleb answered for them both. "Yes, please, Mrs." Bennett left them briefly, returning with two solemn-faced children. Matthew, the boy, had sandy brown hair and serious blue eyes that assessed the strangers cautiously. Emma, smaller and more delicate, clutched a worn rag doll and half hid behind her brother. "Matthew, Emma, these are Mr. and Mrs. Tucker," Mrs. Bennett introduced them gently. "They've come all the way from Alta to meet you." Caleb crouched down to the children's level, his manner relaxed and friendly. "Hello, Matthew, Emma. You can call me Caleb if you like. And this is my wife, Harriet." Matthew eyed them suspiciously. "Are you looking to adopt?" he asked bluntly. Harriet knelt beside Caleb, appreciating the boy's directness. "We're considering it, yes. We have a ranch with horses and cattle and a big garden. There's plenty of room for children who might like such a place." "We stay together," Matthew declared, his arm moving protectively around his sister's shoulders. "I promised Pa before he died. We wouldn't want it any other way," Caleb assured him. "Brothers and sisters should stay together." Emma peered from behind Matthew, her curiosity apparently overcoming her shyness. "Do you have any other children?" she asked in a small voice. Harriet shook her head. "No, we've been waiting for the right children to complete our family. Mrs. Tucker can't have babies of her own," Caleb explained gently, "but we have a lot of love to give if you'd be willing to let us try." The simple honesty of this statement brought tears to Harriet's eyes. She'd never discussed her barrenness so openly. Yet Caleb spoke of it without shame or regret, merely as a fact that had led them to this moment, these children. Matthew considered this solemnly. "Our ma had 3 babies that died before they were born," he offered after a moment. "She was real sad about it. Then she had me, and later Emma." The casual revelation stunned Harriet. This boy's mother, a woman who had eventually carried 2 children to term, had also known the grief of losing pregnancies. The connection, however tenuous, felt significant. "I'm sorry about your ma and pa," Harriet said softly. "It must be very hard." Matthew nodded, his composure slipping slightly to reveal the vulnerable child beneath. "Pa taught me to ride and fish. He said he'd teach me to hunt when I turned 7. "I could teach you those things," Caleb offered, "if you wanted to learn. We have good fishing in the creek on our property and plenty of safe places to ride." Emma tugged at her brother's sleeve, whispering something in his ear. Matthew listened, then asked, "My sister wants to know if you have a garden. She likes flowers." Harriet smiled at the little girl. "We have a very nice garden with vegetables and flowers. I could teach you about planting seeds and watching things grow if you'd like that." Emma nodded shyly, offering the first tentative smile Harriet had seen from her. Mrs. Bennett suggested they spend some time together in the orphanage's small courtyard, where the children might feel more comfortable. Over the next hour, they talked about the ranch, answered Matthew's practical questions about schooling and chores, and listened to Emma's whispered descriptions of her doll's adventures. By the time Mrs. Bennett returned, both children were sitting closer to Harriet and Caleb, their initial wariness somewhat diminished. "We'll need to return to Alta tomorrow," Caleb explained to the children. "But we'd like to come back in a week or 2 if you'd be willing to see us again." Matthew looked at his sister, some silent communication passing between them before he nodded. "That would be acceptable," he said with a gravity that belied his 6 years. As they prepared to leave, Emma suddenly darted forward and pressed her doll into Harriet's hands. "Her name's Clara," the child whispered. "She can stay with you until you come back, so you don't forget us." Harriet knelt to accept the precious offering, understanding the magnitude of trust it represented. "I'll take very good care of her," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. "And we won't forget you, Emma, not for a single day." On the stage coach back to Alta, Clara, the doll tucked safely in Harriet's reticule, she and Caleb discussed the meeting, their hopes, their concerns, and ultimately their decision. "I want them," Harriet said simply. "Both of them. If they'll have us." Caleb reached across to squeeze her hand. "So do I. They're remarkable children." The following weeks brought a flurry of activity as they prepared for the possibility of becoming parents. They visited Laramie twice more, each time finding Matthew and Emma more receptive to their presence. They converted the spare bedroom into a children's room with 2 small beds, a chest for toys, and a rocking chair where stories could be read. Harriet sewed curtains with fabric patterned with stars, knowing how Matthew had expressed interest in constellations during their visits. By early July, all the necessary papers had been arranged. Judge Harper, who had overseen the rustling case the previous fall, reviewed and approved the adoption petition with evident satisfaction. Mrs. Bennett declared herself thoroughly content with the placement, having visited the ranch herself to ensure its suitability. On a bright summer morning, almost exactly 1 year after Harriet had been cast out of Alta for being barren, she and Caleb returned to Laramie to bring their children home. The journey back to Alta was filled with Matthew's endless questions about the ranch and Emma's quiet wonder at the changing landscape. By the time they arrived, both children were exhausted but visibly excited to see their new home. "Is that it?" Matthew asked as the ranch came into view from the final ridge. "It's big, that's it," Caleb confirmed, pride evident in his voice. "Home." "Our home now, too?" Emma asked, her small voice uncertain. "Your home forever," Harriet assured her, heart swelling with an emotion too complex and beautiful for simple naming. "For as long as you want it to be." Pete and the other ranch hands had prepared a welcome banner, strung between 2 porch columns. Margaret Porter waited on the steps, a basket of freshly baked cookies in her arms. Even Sheriff Davis had ridden out, bringing carved wooden toys as gifts for the children. As they entered the ranch yard, Harriet caught Caleb's gaze over the children's heads. His eyes held the same wonder and gratitude she felt that somehow, out of loss and rejection, they had found not just each other, but this. A family, a future, a love that expanded to embrace 2 children who needed exactly what they had to give. That night, after the visitors had departed and the children were tucked into their new beds, Harriet and Caleb stood in the doorway of the children's room, watching the steady rise and fall of small chests in the lamplight. "They're really here," Harriet whispered, still hardly able to believe it. "They're ours." Caleb's arm tightened around her waist. "Ours," he agreed, "though I suspect it will take time for them to truly feel that way." "We have time," Harriet reminded him, echoing his words from months earlier. "Time to build the family that's right for us." As they retired to their own room, Harriet reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from the shame and rejection of her divorce to the fullness of this new life. Being cast out had seemed like an ending, but it had merely been the beginning of a different path than she'd expected to walk. And beside her on that path, filling her days with love just as he'd promised, was Caleb Tucker, the man who had seen value in her beyond her ability to bear children, who had offered partnership when others had seen only failure, who had helped her build a home where love, not blood, defined family. In the years that followed, the Tucker Ranch thrived, as did the family that called it home. Matthew grew into a skilled horseman under Caleb's tutelage, eventually taking over more responsibilities as he matured. Emma's initially shy nature blossomed into quiet confidence, her garden rivaling Harriet's in beauty and productivity. They added a 3rd child to their family, a boy of 9 named Joshua, rescued from an abusive situation in a mining camp, and later fostered several others who needed temporary homes. The Reynolds family's influence in Alta gradually waned. Harold died in 1882, leaving his empire divided among relatives who lacked his ruthless drive. Thomas prospered in San Francisco, occasionally sending polite letters and gifts for the children, apparently finding peace in his new life far from Wyoming. Harriet never bore children of her own, though not for lack of hope during the early years of her marriage. Eventually, she came to see this not as a failure, but simply as the circumstance that had led her to the children who needed her children who might otherwise have been separated, or never found a permanent home at all. On their 20th wedding anniversary, as Caleb and Harriet sat on their porch watching grandchildren, Matthew's 2 boys, playing in the yard, he turned to her with the same steady gaze that had first won her trust all those years ago. "Any regrets?" he asked, a question he posed periodically throughout their marriage, though he surely knew the answer. Harriet squeezed his hand, lined now with age and years of hard work but still strong and sure in hers. "Not one," she replied truthfully. "You filled my days with love just as you promised. And together, we created something far more precious than I ever imagined possible." In that moment, watching the future generations of their unconventional family at play, Harriet felt a completeness that transcended biology, a fulfillment born not of what her body had produced, but of what her heart, alongside Caleb's, had built, a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone.